A very good evening, friends. So, I hope you're all safe as well as healthy. Well, in this particular month, I have been talking in terms of Indus 8, and I think the journey on Indus 8 would be incomplete unless we talk also in terms of para number 40A of Indus 1. Now, what is this para number 40A of Indus 1? Indus 1 talks of presentation of financial statements, wherein we also talk in terms of making a complete set of financial statements, which is given in para number 10. And para number 10 of Indus 1 gives a reference that in case there has been a change in accounting policy with a retrospective effect, or there has been some correction of errors which are material in nature, there is a need to make a third balance sheet which is at the beginning of the preceding financial year. That means, let's say, for example, if there is an error which is, let's say, located in the year 1920, which is the current year, we're going to make a comparatives in the year 1819, and you are required to make a third balance sheet on 1st April 18, which is the beginning of the preceding year. Now, my focus today is when does a third balance sheet get triggered? Now, I think the emphasis is more on the fact that if you're looking in terms of making a balance sheet, what I call a third balance sheet, the focus is in terms of assets and liability. Now, there are two very interesting questions which are given in the education material also, and I'm going to pick up those particular questions in order to illustrate the concept of a third balance sheet to you. Let's, I think, look at two questions in detail to find out when does a third balance sheet gets triggered. तारीख और समय नोट कर लीजिए, क्योंकि ये तारीख और समय आपको जिता सकती है बहुत सारे इनाम। 24 अप्रैल 12 बजे यानी कि संडे को सीए इंटरमीडिएट का एक मेगा कॉम्पैक्ट कंपटीशन होने जा रहा है अनअकैडमी पर। इसके अंदर आपको 60 मिनट्स के अंदर 40 क्वेश्चंस आंसर करने होंगे और आप इस टेस्ट के लिए, इस कंपटीशन के लिए फ्री रजिस्टर कर सकते हैं। यदि आप अनअकैडमी प्लेटफॉर्म पर नए हैं तो आप मेरा कोड इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं CAKB10 और इस टेस्ट को अनलॉक कर सकते हैं। इस टेस्ट के अंदर जो लकी पार्टिसिपेंट्स होंगे उनको जीतने को मिलेंगे एप्पल आईपैड, सैमसंग के टैब और JBL स्पीकर्स और Amazon के बहुत सारे वाउचर्स। ये टेस्ट इंडिया के टॉप एजुकेटर्स द्वारा क्यूरेट किया गया है और इसके अंदर जो टॉप 150 रैंकर्स होंगे उनको 100% स्कॉलरशिप मिलेगी सब्सक्रिप्शंस पर। तो इसके अंदर आप टेस्ट में पार्टिसिपेट कीजिए और खूब सारे इनाम जीत सकते हैं। तो तारीख याद रखिएगा, 24 अप्रैल 12 बजे देयर इज इंटरमीडिएट मेगा कॉम्पैक्ट कॉम्पिटिशन। डिस्क्रिप्शन बॉक्स के अंदर आपको लिंक मिलेगा जिससे आप इस टेस्ट के लिए रजिस्टर कर सकते हैं। और यदि आप नए हैं तो मैंने जैसे कहा, यू कैन यूज माय कोड CAKB10 टू अनलॉक द टेस्ट फॉर फ्री। तो किस बात का इंतजार है, आइए लेट्स क्रैक इट। बिफोर आई कंसिडर द क्वेश्चंस विद यू, I think let me first of all focus on one particular aspect. When I'm looking at the concept of a third balance sheet, I would say there are three triggering conditions which one needs to focus on. Number one, there has been, you can say, a retrospective change in accounting policy, or there has been, it's not the second condition, I'm on the first condition only, there has been a retrospective change in accounting policy, or there has been a correction of a material error, or we can say there is a reclassification of item. Number two, the impact of this retrospective change in policy is something which is material. The correction of the error is something which is material, or the reclassification is also material. And number three, most important, is that it should trigger the asset or liability change in the balance sheet. So if there is an error which, let's say, is affecting only an income or expense but not an asset or liability, then a third balance sheet is not going to trigger. So we're going to put across a total of three questions to ourselves. We're going to put across question number one: is there a change in accounting policy, or a correction of error, or a reclassifications in the financials? Does it have a material effect, and is it impacting asset or liability, not income and expense. In that particular case, we would say a third balance sheet would get triggered. Let's, I think, have a look at two questions with you. Well, if you look at the first question, I am given an entity has presented certain material liability. Look at the word material liabilities as non-current. So I think two conditions are met, that you have done a presentation and that is material liability as non-current in the financial statements up to March 18. But when we are making the financial statements for the year 19, the management discovers that these liability should have been taken as current. So you presented current liability as non-current. Now presentation is definitely an error. If there is a mistake in terms of presentation, it gets covered in an error. It very clearly says it's material and very clearly it says it's impacting a liability. So if you look at my three conditions, I think they are met. It says, would this reclassification of liabilities from non-current to current in the comparative amounts be considered as a correction of error under Ind AS 8? Yes, of course. Would the entity need to present a third balance sheet as well? Yes, of course. So we can say that if I look into three parameters, is there a correction of error? A presentation mistake is an error. Does it have a material effect? Yes. Is it impacting a liability in the balance sheet, asset or liability? Yes. Third balance sheet gets triggered. The company would be required to make a balance sheet on 1st April 17 in this particular case. Let's have a look at another question with you. Let's read this first. It says an entity charged of certain expenses. The focus is on the word expenses, which is not an asset or liability, as a finance cost in the financial statements for the year ended 18. While preparing the annual financial statements for the year 19, management discovered that these expenses should have been taken as other expense instead of finance cost. So the error occurred due to the management inadvertently misinterpreted certain facts. The entity needs to restate the comparative amounts for the prior year that is ended March 18. Would this reclassification of expense from finance to other expense in the comparatives be considered as correction of errors? Yes. Would the entity need to present a third balance sheet? No. Now look at the contrast in this particular case. First of all, is this leading to a reclassification of an expense in the financials? Yes. Does it have a material effect? I think if you're considering an expense to be, a finance cost, whereas it is supposed to be taken as other expense, it is certainly material in nature. But is it impacting any asset or liability in the balance sheet? No. Since it is not impacting an asset or liability in the balance sheet, a third balance sheet would not get triggered. So you can see in the two contrasting questions that in first question, it was a case of error. That was one. Then it was a case where we said it is material, but we also said that asset and liability is getting impacted. In this example, we can see that it is a case of error 1. It has got material impact 2, but it's not impacting asset or liability. So the focus in terms of third balance sheet is that it should impact the asset or liability, not income and expense. So that is what we need to take care when we are looking that if there is a error rectification or a change in policy or a reclassifications. In all the cases, the most pertinent question is that opening balance sheet, the third balance sheet, it should affect asset or liability. That's all in this particular video. Thank you for watching. Bye bye and take care.